5 hieroglyphic inscriptions. 5 separate arguments among working Egyptologists that are still not settled. Each one forced scholars to revise something they thought they already understood about ancient Egypt, and in one case, about the origin of writing itself. The evidence for all 5 sits in translations that already exist. You just have to know where to look. For most of the history of Egyptology, a damaged hieroglyphic surface meant a lost text. If the paint had faded, if the stone had eroded, if centuries of handling had worn a carved register, down to a faint suggestion of lines, the information was treated as gone. Scholars copied what they could see and left the rest to speculation. That assumption did not survive contact with a technology developed for an entirely different purpose. Multispectral imaging was built to study the surface of the Earth and other planets from orbit. Researchers including D.M. Chabriez, Stephen Burris, and Gregory Behrman, working out of Brigham Young University, adapted the method for something far closer to home, reading what conventional photography could not. The technique captures a surface across multiple wavelengths of light, well beyond the narrow band the human eye can register, and looks for contrast that only appears outside that range. Ink and pigment that have become invisible to the eye often still absorb or reflect light, differently than the stone or papyrus beneath them. The results reached the Dead Sea Scrolls first, then the carbonized papyrus rolls of Herculaneum, sealed by volcanic ash since 79 AD. Then the Maya murals at Bonampak. In 2020, a team led by researcher Alessia Spolador published a study applying the same imaging process directly to an Egyptian stele, recovering hieroglyphic text that had been effectively unreadable through standard examination. No new excavation was required. No sealed chamber was opened. The inscription had been sitting in a museum collection the entire time, cataloged and photographed and misread, because no one had the tool to see what was actually carved there. That has a direct bearing on how to watch everything that follows. If a documented peer-reviewed piece of evidence can sit in a museum basement for decades before anyone reads it correctly, the accepted version of a period of history is never really finished. It is simply the best reading available with the tools that existed at the time. Each of the 5 cases in this video follows that same shape. Not a discovery pulled from the sand for the first time, but an inscription that was already known, already translated once, and then read again, with a sharper question, producing a different answer than the one that had stood for decades. The first of those arguments concerns a single grammatical choice, made by an Egyptian scribe more than 3,000 years ago, that historians are still fighting about today. In 1896, the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie excavated a granite slab at Thebes, more than 3 meters tall, inscribed with 25 lines of hieroglyphic text, recounting the military campaigns of the pharaoh Merneptah. Petrie's colleague, Wilhelm Spiegelberg, crawled into the excavation trench alongside him and copied the hieroglyphics by hand. Petrie predicted, correctly, that the stele would become more famous than anything else he had found in his career. The inscription lists several conquered territories along Merneptah's campaign through Canaan, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam. Each of those names is written with a specific hieroglyphic determinative, a silent sign added to clarify meaning, in this case, a throw stick combined with 3 mountains, the standard marker Egyptian scribes used for a foreign city or place. One name on that list does not follow the pattern: Israel. Instead of the city determinative, the scribe used a throw stick paired with a seated man and woman above 3 vertical plural strokes, the sign Egyptian scribes reserved for a people rather than a location. The stele reads, in translation, Israel is laid waste, its seed is not. Scholars have argued about the significance of that single sign since at least 1955, when Egyptologist John A. Wilson first raised the possibility that it identified Israel as an ethnic or social group rather than a settled territory. Wilson called the argument good, but not conclusive, pointing to what he described as the notorious carelessness of late Egyptian scribes and several other blunders of writing found elsewhere on the same stela. That caution has never fully settled the argument, because the alternative explanation, that a scribe simply reused a familiar sign out of habit, is impossible to prove or disprove 70 years later. If the determinative was deliberate, it places a people called Israel in Canaan by 1207 BCE, organized enough for an Egyptian pharaoh to count their defeat worth boasting about, but not yet consolidated into a city-state Egypt recognized as a place. That distinction, a people rather than a place, is the entire reason biblical scholars and Egyptologists still return to this single line of text. The debate did not stay contained to one stele. In the early 2000s, Egyptologist Manfred Gerg identified hieroglyphic name rings on a broken statue pedestal held in the Egyptian Museum of Berlin. Working with researchers Peter van der Veen and Christopher Thijs, Gerg proposed that one of those name rings should also be read as Israel, this time dated to roughly 1400 BCE, nearly 2 centuries before Merneptah's campaign. If correct, the earliest Egyptian reference to Israel would move from a victory boast about a people already being wiped out to a much earlier, far more neutral, administrative mention, changing the picture from a people at the edge of destruction to a people simply present in the region, 2 centuries earlier than anyone had documented. The reading is not universally accepted. The spelling on the pedestal differs slightly from the Merneptah inscription, and several Egyptologists remain unconvinced the fragment names the same group at all. Gerg, van der Veen, and Thijs have pointed to supportive parallels within the Merneptah text itself to defend the reading, but the dispute remains open in the published literature rather than resolved. What is not in dispute is this: a single hieroglyphic sign, chosen or misapplied by one scribe more than 3,000 years ago, is still shaping how historians date the earliest recorded presence of a people in the ancient world. No new stone has to be found to reopen that argument. The stone has been in a museum case the entire time. A second granite block, from the same broad period of Egyptian history, raises a very different kind of question. Not about who was living where, about whether a natural disaster on the far side of the Mediterranean left its mark on Egyptian stone. Between 1947 and 1951, archaeological teams clearing the third pylon at the Temple of Karnak recovered fragments of a calcite stela, once standing nearly 6 feet tall, inscribed on both faces with 40 lines of hieroglyphic text. The stela dates to the reign of Ahmose I, founder of Egypt's 18th dynasty, and the pharaoh who launched the new kingdom. The inscription describes an event most royal texts do not bother recording: weather, darkness across the land, rain falling without stopping, a sky, in the words of the translation, in storm without cessation, louder than the cries of the crowd. For decades, Egyptologists read this as royal propaganda, a stock literary flourish meant to dramatize the chaos Ahmose supposedly restored order to. Nadine Moeller and Robert Rittner, both of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, published a new translation arguing otherwise. Their reading proposed that the stela was describing a real and specific catastrophe: the eruption of Thera, the volcanic island now known as Santorini, across the Mediterranean from Egypt. The implications reached well past a single inscription. If Ahmose's reign overlapped with the Thera eruption closely enough for Egyptian scribes to record its atmospheric effects, his reign would need to be dated 30 to 50 years earlier than the conventional figure of 1550 BCE. Because Egyptian chronology anchors much of the dating used across the ancient Near East, a shift in Ahmose's reign would ripple outward into how historians sequence the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of the Hyksos, and the rise of Minoan trade networks. Oriental Institute scholar David Schloen went further, suggesting the same eruption may help explain how Ahmose managed to overthrow the Hyksos in the first place. A tsunami generated by the Thera explosion could have struck the Hyksos-controlled ports of the eastern Nile Delta directly, disrupting the trade and naval power that had propped up their rule for over a century. On that reading, a foreign dynasty's grip on Egypt did not simply weaken. It was physically dismantled by a wave that began on an island the Egyptians had likely never heard of. For years, the Tempest Stele theory sat in direct tension with radiocarbon evidence. A 2006 study of an olive tree buried under Thera's volcanic ash dated the eruption to between 1621 and 1605 BCE, uncomfortably early for a Moses' traditional reign. The gap between the archaeological chronology and the radiocarbon chronology became one of the more stubborn open disputes in Eastern Mediterranean archaeology. So, if you want more of this, the kind of ancient mystery that holds up under scrutiny, instead of collapsing the moment someone checks the footnotes, this channel goes directly to the field reports and the peer-reviewed translations every week. Consider subscribing. Then, in October 2025, an international research team from Ben-Gurion University of the Negev and the University of Groningen published new radiocarbon findings in the journal PLOS One. Their conclusion undercut the Tempest Stele theory directly. The Thera eruption, their data showed, most likely occurred before a Moses' reign began, extending the length of Egypt's fragmented Second Intermediate period rather than compressing it. The 40 lines of hieroglyphic text describing rain and darkness read exactly as they did when they were first pieced together at Karnak. What changed is the surrounding evidence, and with it, the story those 40 lines are now believed to be telling. That correction is not a weakness in the field. Working scholars proposed a translation, tested it against independent physical evidence, and revised their conclusion when the evidence did not hold up. Very few documentary channels will walk you through a theory getting overturned in real time. This one just did. Because the correction is part of the story, these inscriptions are still telling. In January of 2014, an archaeological team from the University of Pennsylvania, led by Dr. Joseph Wegner, excavated a badly damaged tomb at South Abydos, in Egypt's Sohag province. The tomb had been robbed in antiquity. Its roof was gone. Its stone sarcophagus was broken. Nothing remained of its occupant but a scattered skeleton. What survived was the wall. Painted hieroglyphic text on the limestone burial chamber identified the tomb's owner by name, sealed inside a royal cartouche, Wo Celebre Seneb-Kay. No such pharaoh appeared in any king list, any temple record, or any inscription previously known to Egyptology. He had ruled by the evidence of his own tomb, and then vanished from every surviving record, except the one carved directly above his burial. Egyptologist Kim Ryholt had proposed, back in 1997, that a small regional dynasty might have ruled from Abydos during Egypt's Second Intermediate period, a chaotic stretch between roughly 1650 and 1550 BCE, when the kingdom fractured into competing regional powers. The theory had support from other scholars, including Detlef Franke, but it remained a hypothesis with no tomb and no physical confirmation. Seneb-Kay's burial chamber provided both at once. Fragments of the Turin king list, a badly damaged papyrus record of Egyptian kings, preserved a partial throne name consistent with the name painted on his wall. An entire dynasty, previously theoretical, became historical fact because one scribe painted a king's name on plaster more than 3,500 years ago. The skeleton itself added a second layer to the story the wall had already told. Analysis of the remains showed a man roughly 5'10" who died in his mid to late 40s. No funerary goods survived in the tomb, consistent with a burial robbed in antiquity rather than one that had simply been modest to begin with. Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities official Ayman El-Damarani noted that Seneb-Kay appeared to have ruled for around 4.5 years, a comparatively long reign for a period in which regional kings rose and fell quickly. None of that biography exists anywhere else. It survives only because a scribe took the time to paint a name inside a cartouche on a wall that was never meant to be read again after the burial was sealed. The story did not end in 2014. In April of 2025, the same excavation team, still working the necropolis Egyptologists now call the Mountain of Anubis, uncovered a second royal tomb. This one is substantially larger than Seneb-Kay's, its main chamber nearly 6 meters long, and its position within the site suggests it was built earlier, for a wealthier and more established ruler. Hieroglyphic inscriptions were painted directly onto the plastered brickwork at the tomb's entrance. Ancient looters had already found the tomb first, and the section bearing the king's name was damaged beyond reading. Two candidates exist. Kings Seneb and Paintieni are both named on surviving monuments from the period, but neither king's tomb had been located until this excavation. Wegner's team cannot yet say which king, if either, is buried in the newly opened chamber. Excavations are continuing, using magnetometry and photogrammetry to map the rest of the necropolis, and further tombs from the same dynasty are considered likely to still be underground. An entire ruling lineage, unknown to history for more than 3,000 years, confirmed by paint on a wall, and the same necropolis that gave up that confirmation in 2014 is still, in 2025, withholding the name of the king in its largest tomb. Which raises an uncomfortable question about how much of Egypt's fractured middle history is still sitting underground, waiting for a scribe's paint to survive just long enough to be read. The final case concerns the origin of writing itself, and it begins in a valley the ancient Egyptians apparently found unsettling enough to name after fear: Wadi el-Hol. The name translates roughly to Gulch of Terror, a valley on the Farshut Road, an ancient route connecting Thebes to Hue along the Nile's west bank, used by Egyptian military and trade expeditions crossing the desert. In 1993, Yale Egyptologists John Coleman Darnell and Deborah Darnell were surveying the route when they found 2 inscriptions carved into the limestone cliffs. At first glance, the signs resembled hieroglyphs. On closer study, they did not behave like hieroglyphs at all. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing is logographic and phonetic at once, built from more than 1,000 distinct signs representing whole words, sounds, and grammatical markers, a system that took years of scribal training to master. The Wadi el-Hol inscriptions borrowed their forms from Egyptian hieroglyphic and hieratic script, then stripped that complexity down to represent individual sounds rather than words or concepts. That structure is the defining feature of an alphabet, built by someone who needed to write without spending years training as a scribe. The Darnells published their findings in 1999, dating the inscriptions to roughly 1800 to 1900 BCE, during Egypt's Middle Kingdom. The signs closely resembled Proto-Sinaitic script, previously known from inscriptions at Serabit el-Qadim, a turquoise mining site in the Sinai Peninsula, where earlier scholars had assumed the fragmentary writing was simply too isolated to explain. Between 2006 and 2020, Israeli Egyptologist Orly Goldwasser extended the case, identifying additional Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions in mining records and temple fragments across Sinai and Upper Egypt, and connecting the individual signs to specific Egyptian hieroglyphic originals. Goldwasser's work traced the underlying principle behind the new script directly. Individual Egyptian hieroglyphs were repurposed to represent the first sound of a West Semitic word for the object each sign originally depicted, stripping away the picture's meaning and keeping only its sound. That single move, picture becomes sound, is the mechanical shift that separates every alphabet in use today from the writing systems that came before it. The emerging picture centers on Semitic-speaking laborers, likely miners and military auxiliaries, working within Egyptian expeditions, who had no access to formal scribal education and no need for a 1,000-sign writing system. What they needed was a way to write their own names, in their own language, using whatever Egyptian signs they had seen. So they took a small number of hieroglyphs, discarded the logographic complexity, and assigned each remaining sign a single sound. A roughly 1700 BCE ivory comb bearing what may be the earliest known complete sentence in an early alphabetic script, supports the same conclusion. This simplification did not happen once, among elite scribes in a single city. It happened gradually, carved by people the formal Egyptian record barely bothered to name. If the Wadi el-Hol reading holds, and it has held up for 3 decades of continued fieldwork, the alphabet used to write nearly every modern language traces back to laborers cutting hieroglyphs into a desert cliff face, in a language their own employers rarely bothered to write down, rather than to professional scribes working in Phoenicia. Egyptian hieroglyphs recorded more than a civilization. In a valley called the Gulch of Terror, they may have given rise to the writing system the rest of the world still uses today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more ancient mysteries and impossible discoveries.